The first part of throwing the buried suture is to grab the wound edge with your forceps and to evert gently, exposing the dermis, the subcutis, and any subcuticular fat. So using the suture, I'm going to enter the subcutis perpendicularly and rotate upwards so that it emerges in the dermis just below the epidermis. The next part is to draw the suture through completely, leaving enough tail right here to sufficiently grab at the end for tying a knot. You want to be sure to do this now rather than after throwing the suture on the other side, because otherwise too much tissue friction could impede your ability to pull the suture through. When we throw the suture on the other side, it's important that we line up the entry and exit points. So here on the initial side, we can see where the trailing end of the suture enters the subcutis, and we can see where the leading end of the suture exits the dermis. So on the other side, if we approximate the edges, we know where we want to enter and where we want to exit. So using my forceps, again, I can evert the opposite wound edge. And so I want to enter about here. But it's a little bit difficult for me to enter the wound completely with my needle. So what I can do instead is perpendicular to the dermis, insert the needle approximately 1/4 to half of the way, and then begin to rotate the needle so that it emerges deep in the subcutis, lining up with the entry site on the other side, and then I can pull it through completely and then draw the suture through neatly. Before I tie the knot of my buried suture, I want to ensure that the knot is going to fall in the right place. Since it is a buried suture, I want to make sure the knot is indeed deep. So let's look at the wrong way to do it, the purple suture. This horizontal suture, like the suture right here, bridging the two ends of the wound, is separating this tail and this end of the suture, so that if we tie it, the knot has no choice but to fall on top of this, and the knot would not be buried. So let's take this one out of the way for a second and look at the correct way it should be oriented. That same horizontal part of the suture is this right here, bridging the two ends of the wound. And if you notice, the beginning of the suture right here and the other end of the suture right here are both above it, or they're both on the same side of this bridge. And so when I tie the knot, it can easily fall deep into the wound under this bridge. So before you go ahead and tie the knot, make sure that they're oriented correctly. So now tying the knot is very similar to tying the knot of the simple suture, in that we wrap twice around, grasp the trailing end, and draw it through. So now we can pull tightly so that the knot gets buried into the wound. But we want to make sure that it doesn't come unraveled. So we rotate the suture so that it's parallel with the plane of the wound, and we can draw it tightly in either direction. And now from here, either pull downwards or pull tensely upwards, and that causes the suture to slide over itself and to lock it.
The principle of locking a knot is as follows. You want to make this parallel to the wound edge, and the idea is this string and that string are now going to become perpendicular to the tails of the wound. What I'm going to do as I pull this, either pull this string down or this string up, I'm going to make this slide along here and this slide along here. So I'm going to force that to happen. And now what you'll see is that these two, and obviously if it were less coefficient of friction, it works nicely. You see that this hump and that hump are perpendicular to the tails here and there. Okay, now I can throw the next knot. And the next knot you can do in a similar way. So you lock, this regular knot is going to lock in place the initial lock. Okay, that's number one. And now I can also, pull down on this, and you see the hump just came out, and now this hump is perpendicular to the tails. And now I can lock the second lock, and I'm locking this down, okay, in place. And again, I can, do it strong and pull down and make that flip out. And the idea is now, again, this is perpendicular to the tails, and then I can cut the suture.
And so then we just continue to tie our knots as we would for any ordinary suture, wrapping once around, grasping the loose end with the needle driver, pulling in opposite directions along the axis of the wound, and then we can pull down to lock this as well. And then a third time should be sufficient. And we can pull up to lock. When cutting the knot, it is important to keep in mind the orientation of your scissors. In this orientation, the bottom blade is rested upon the knot, and so when we slide down, cutting would result in a clean cut above the knot without breaking the knot itself. On the other hand, if we angled the scissors such that the top blade was the one resting upon the suture and we slid down, cutting would result in the bottom blade severing the knot. So now when we cut the suture, we want to make sure that we leave no excess tail. And we can do this by placing the bottom blade onto the suture, dragging it down or sliding it down the suture towards the knot, resting upon the knot, placing traction on the suture, and then snipping. The tension that I placed on the suture, pulling it outwards, sort of creates like a recoil effect, so that once I cut the suture, it rebounds back into the wound, being buried.
When the knot is buried, you'll notice that the knots are pointing downward. So when it's time, when we're cutting the knot here, what's happening is we're pulling up, the scissors are coming down, we're cutting, and then the knot flips down and points downward in the buried direction.